If a ship's IMO number does get sanctioned, that ship is now blacklisted. The ship itself is blacklisted. What happens to it?
It depends who the sanctioning entity is. US sanctions are a lot stickier because most transactions are in US dollars, and so therefore it kind of has a little bit more oomph.
Welcome to Trade Finance Talks, your go-to trade, treasury and payments podcast. Brought to you by Trade Finance Global.
Hello and welcome to another edition of Trade Finance Talks. I'm Sylvia Andreotti, Senior Reporter at Trade Finance Global, and today I'm here with Michelle Veazey-Buchman, Senior Maritime Intelligence Analyst at Windward. Michelle, thank you for being here.
Thanks very much for having me.
My first question today is about the shadow fleet, which I think lots of people talk about and we hear about a lot in the news, but I think it's really misunderstood. So can you explain the path of ships that enter the shadow fleet? How and why a ship gets picked to become a part of the shadow fleet, what happens in between it starting to operate and then until the moment it gets sanctioned and blacklisted?
It's going to take a while to answer, but I'm going to give it a go. So first of all, shadow fleet, dark fleet, ghost fleet, parallel fleet. There's a lot of different terms to describe vessels that are essentially solely deployed in shipping sanctioned oil for either Russia, Venezuela, and Iran predominantly. But there's no fixed definition. But when you step back and then you look at the typology, typically they're elderly vessels, 15 years or plus, not always, but mostly, again, solely deployed in sanctioned oil trades and also liquefied petroleum gas trades and liquefied natural gas trades as well, increasingly. They use a variety of deceptive shipping practices in order to continue shipping that sanctioned oil, and I won't describe them now, but we can go into that if you're interested. And also, the beneficial owner is unknown. So the real owner is hidden behind Byzantine structures in permissive jurisdictions from Mauritius, Seychelles, Hong Kong, China, single ship entities that make it very, very hard to track who's really behind it. How does a ship get picked to become part of the shadow fleet? Well, let's just focus on Russia, I think, because that's probably easiest. Because obviously, while we don't know the ownership of the vessels, we do know that the money that was used to buy them has come from the Russian government. And the Russian government has spent about $15 billion on amassing this fleet. There's about, solely in Russian trades, about 650 vessels involved. It's quite a lot. And they didn't always used to be sanctioned. That's something that's only really happened in the last 18 months. Both the European Union and the UK changed laws so they could actually sanction ships by their IMO number, their International Maritime Organization number. And that's the 9-digit number that's given to every ship when they're built, and it stays with that vessel for its life. While these vessels often change their flag, their name, they cycle through different special purpose vehicles for ownership, the IMO number always stays the same. Because there's such a demand for sanctions circumventing ships, the dark fleet, or the shadow fleet, has tripled in size since Russia invaded Ukraine. Unfortunately, most of the vessels that they purchased have come from European owners. I like to use a car analogy. When we all buy a car, we have it for about 5 or 6 years, and then we start to worry that it's not so new anymore, it's going to get expensive, and so we sell it on to somebody else that doesn't mind getting a cheaper car, and we go and buy ourselves a new one. And that's essentially what's happened. There was a ready-made market for ships over 15 years of age. That's when they have to have special surveys. And, when you look at your spreadsheet and money out, money in, often a lot of European owners make the decision that now's the time to sell the vessel. And it just so happened that there were a lot of arrangements that could be put in place that allowed them to quite legally sell them to entities that ultimately traded them in Russia. That's a very long way of, I hope, giving you an introduction and an explainer to the dark fleet.
You were saying that a ship's IMO number can now be sanctioned.
Yeah.
So if a ship's IMO number does get sanctioned, that ship is now blacklisted. The ship itself is blacklisted. What happens to it?
It depends who the sanctioning entity is. US sanctions are a lot stickier because most transactions are in US dollars, and so therefore it kind of has a little bit more oomph. With the UK, with the EU, those vessels, even though they've been sanctioned, and they've sanctioned about 550 vessels in the last 18 months, they typically will still trade to India and China, which are obviously the biggest destinations for Russian crude, for example. But cargo sometimes doesn't go from point A to point B. There might be ship-to-ship transfers in between in order to disguise or make it more difficult to track the destination and the origin of the crude. Even US sanctioned ships, we've found, will still call it specific terminals in China, like we call them teapot refineries. They're in northern China, and they're independent refineries, and they're not owned by the Chinese government. So they're perhaps, well, there's a whole lot of reasons to do with the global oil market about why they are able to take Russian oil that's maybe sanctioned on ships that are sanctioned. But essentially, it does frustrate the vessel's ability to trade. But we're in the middle of what I say is an unprecedented foreign policy experiment. We've never seen the prevalence of so many sanctioned ships trading and operating outside international rules-based order with all of their deceptive shipping practices. Nobody has really been able to forecast what will be the outcome of having so many sanctioned vessels on the water. When it comes to Aframax tankers, for example, and they're the ones that are most commonly used to ship Russian crude because they're smaller in size and so they can call on the ports, about 80% of dark fleet tankers are now sanctioned in that vessel class. When you look at all the world's Aframax crude tankers, about 20%, 30% are now sanctioned outside that. So it's quite a new problem that the industry is grappling with right now. There's no easy answer as to why they continue to trade, and it all goes to enforcement. And of course, how much diplomatic pressure can be borne on India and China and Turkey. And of course, now we've got not only the vessel sanction, but in October 15, the UK announced sanctions on Rosneft and Lukoil, which are Russia's largest oil producers, followed by the UK on the 22nd, also sanctioning Rosneft and Lukoil. So that's kind of added an extra dimension to these sanctions, and it's all playing out now in the oil markets.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and it sounds like it's evolving really quickly as well.
It certainly is. And oil flows from Russia are getting darker. Like Iran, for example, that's primarily under unilateral US sanctions, and 1.6 million barrels per day, despite US sanctions, flows primarily from Iran to China on a shadow fleet, using deceptive shipping practices and operating largely outside international rules-based order. And that's a huge concern for anybody in the trading community. We have 11 billion tons a year of seaborne trade. Sizable proportion of that is now operating outside international rules-based order. About 17% of seaborne crude is now under unilateral oil and shipping sanctions. So it's a perspective and a problem that we're really, really needing to come to terms with very quickly.
Hey, enjoying the episode? Tap follow for more. Done? Let's get back to it.
I want to go back to what you were saying a bit earlier about ships flagged under, you said Mauritius or Hong Kong, and you were talking about the importance of enforcement. So can you tell us a bit about the importance of having strong flag registries in the context of enforcement, why it's important for a country to have one, and what happens if a country doesn't have a strong flag register?
Well, if I can just correct you there, the use of Mauritius and Seychelles is for the registered owner and then the ISM manager, so the technical manager of the ship. They cherry pick all of these jurisdictions and they set up a single ship company with a brass plate address, and then they flag somewhere completely different. I like to use a license analogy when I explain about flag governance. So, we're doing this interview here in the UK. If we have a car and we want to drive that car, we have to get a license for it and we have to register that car. And we have to register it in the UK, right? Because we're on the UK roads. But in shipping, you can be a ship owner and you can have a ship and you can say, you know what, I'm in the UK, but I don't like the UK rules. They're too tough. So I'm going to shop around and I'm going to look for somebody that has the lowest rules of all, or no rules, or won't check my papers and won't care what condition my car is. And you know what? I think I'm going to go to Sierra Leone or Gambia, or hang on a sec, maybe I'll go to Comoros. What's happened is that there's become what's been a cottage industry of low quality flags. Like the governments of those countries have essentially contracted private operators to run those flags on their behalf. And those private operators have thought, you know what? I'm going to opportunistically go after this market because there's a lot of people that want to flag their ships in jurisdictions where they're not going to have very much oversight. So in the first 18 months after the G7 oil price cap was implemented on Russian oil and shipping, which created this sanctions circumventing situation, a lot of vessels decided to flag in Gabon, Barbados, Cook Island, and these flag registries went from having 10 or 12 tankers to 100 tankers in their fleet. And then, of course, sanctions started to become quite an issue in these vessels, so they found themselves flagging vessels that were sanctioned. The EU and the UK specifically, diplomatically, went to the governments of these countries that had allowed these private registries to act on their behalf and said, hey, this is not good. We've sanctioned this vessel. You should delete it from your registry. Barbados, Gabon, I think Gabon was sanctioned, the private registry, so that made things a bit trickier for them. So a lot of these flags then deleted the vessels from the registry. So then they had to find another permissive registry. And so they began a practice, a deceptive shipping practice that's called flag hopping. So they go from flag to flag to flag. And some of these have 5 or 6 flags in the last 6 months, alongside changes in names and registered owners, etc. Alongside that, as if that wasn't bad enough, because the condition of these vessels, I say a lot of them, they're elderly, they're not being looked after, they're floating rust buckets and a threat to environment, safety, they imperil crew welfare. So then they decided they would use fraudulent registries. So these are registries that the IMO has gone to the country and they've said Benin, a lot of them are just African countries like Benin, Botswana, Zambia, and they've said, hey, you haven't set up international ship registry, have you? And they've certainly not. And they've said, well, we've got 40 ships claiming they're broadcasting on their vessel tracking system, they're flagged with Benin. And Benin's gone, no, we don't have a registry. There's 18 of these fraudulent registries that Windward has identified in the last 6 months. When you look at sanctioned vessels, about 2/3 of all sanctioned vessels are now flying what we call false flags. So they're stateless, they're flagless. If they have any insurance or any certificates of seaworthiness from classification societies or recognised organisations, they're invalidated by their false flag status. So they're just plying the oceans completely, again, outside international rules-based order. And that is one of the biggest emerging threats, especially for coastal states through which these vessels traverse in order to reach, say, the Russian Baltic ports. They have to go through firstly through the English Channel, then through environmentally sensitive waters, the Danish Strait, through the Gulf of Finland, through very treacherous waters in this stateless, flagless state. And people often say, well, how can they do this? Why can't they be stopped? There's a United Nations Convention of the Law of the Seas, which grants these vessels the right of innocent passage. Coastal states, even if they go through their waters, they have to let them go through. That's a fundamental principle of global trade. If you could stop them if they go through the Danish Straits, then who's to say that vessels from Europe, European vessels won't be stopped elsewhere? I'm raving. It's a really, really complex problem.
Speaking about threats, I want to kind of pivot a little bit to physical threats on ships. Have you seen an increase on physical threats recently? So we've heard a lot about, I think, Ukrainian attacks on the Russian shadow fleet, but also I think a year ago we were hearing a lot about piracy. Have you noticed them increasing? And if so, kind of what's the effect on global supply chains?
I think on November 28, on the Friday, we had 2 Shadow Fleet tankers that were attacked by Ukrainian drones in the Black Sea. That is a very worrying development. These vessels were both fraudulently flagged, so they were falsely claiming to fly the flag of Gambia. Gambia had actually, I spoke earlier about how there had been diplomatic pressure applied by governments to these permissive registries, and Gambia had been one of them. So Gambia, a couple of weeks ago, went through the list of vessels that had been flagged with it, decided they had all been issued with fraudulent certificates, so withdrew those vessels from their registry. So these vessels, among the 2 of the 72 vessels that Gambia had recently deleted, so they were falsely flagged. So despite that status, it's commercial shipping, and to have a military attack on a commercial vessel is unprecedented. I mean, the last time this has happened, even the attacks from the Houthis on the Red Sea on vessels, on commercial shipping, I mean, there were proxies. They're not a government that's doing that. It really takes us back to the tanker wars of the 1980s, if any listeners are old enough as me to remember that. That's quite the development. However, it's not unprecedented. There have also been about 5 or 6 tankers that have been affected by mines, limpet mines that have been like blown up in ports around the Mediterranean and Europe, and these mystery explosions. The most recent one wasn't a Shadow Fleet tanker. It was a Turkish-owned tanker that had been legitimately involved in price-compliant, shipping Russian refined petroleum products. And that was in floating storage off the port of Dakar, Senegal. That had some limpet mines attached to it and blown up, I think, a couple of days before the attacks on the 2 falsely flagged tankers in the Black Sea. There was another Shadow Fleet tanker that has been damaged after Ukrainians hit a refinery in Novorossiysk in the Black Sea as well. The risk involved in the Black Sea, shipping the Black Sea, if you're a related cargo or tanker, shipping elsewhere, or even if you're doing CAP-compliant trades, that's now been elevated. And personally, I feel a little uncomfortable about commercial shipping being attacked. There's been verified social media attacks of the crew that are evacuating one of the vessels that had been hit. And the fear and the panic, these are people that are just doing a job to feed their family. Sanctions and geopolitics mean nothing to them. Their fear and panic was just as real as the fear and panic I've seen in attacks from the Houthis. And while we condemn the attacks on the Houthis because of their impact on the innocent crew, who's to say that we should be looking at the impact on the crew, even though the ultimate entity responsible was Ukrainian? What does that mean for global trade? Once again, I have to use that horribly overused word, unprecedented. We really are heading into 2026 with a lot of uncertainty and further disruption, unless there's a peace plan that sticks.
That's a really good note to end on. I'm always really, really skeptical of when people say unprecedented times, because it seems like they've been saying that for years. But what you've spoken about today really does sound unprecedented. So thank you so much for joining us today, Michelle.
Thank you very much for having me. Let's hope for a much safer 2026 for crew on all tankers, not just Shadow Fleet tankers.